I'm one of the founders of Eligible. We're a platform for health information exchange. And I thought it would be good to just start off today by giving you a little bit of background into the digital health space, just in case you're not familiar with it. I've spent a few years now in the Valley, and I've been working on healthcare that whole time. The first year, I was an early employee at an EHR company called Dr. Chrono. You guys probably know it. It's an iPad app. Pretty cool. Did a lot of work for iOS there. And during that time, I got to hear all the dirt from about 20,000 different doctors about their electronic health records. Basically got to hear how much they hated the existing systems, and they were dying for iPhone and iPad apps. It's a phenomenon. I mean, the doctors love their iPhone. They love their iPad app. I don't know if it's a status symbol, but it's definitely something. Anyway, in talking to them, I got to find out just how broken the health information exchange in the industry actually is. So before a doctor can actually perform a procedure, they actually contact an insurance company just to confirm that they'll be paid for that procedure. And in healthcare terminology, that's called an eligibility query, right? And in an age where almost everything can happen digitally, you can be on your phone, get a real-time transaction, you can be on the web, real-time transaction, all of these are basically still done by 30-minute phone calls. So you have doctors who have full departments, you have pharmaceutical companies, full departments, laboratories, full departments that make phone calls all day long to find out if someone can get a diagnostic lab, if they have coverage for that, or if they have coverage for an injection. So obviously, huge problem. Last year, 2 trillion just healthcare eligibility queries, and over 90% happened over the telephone. Massive market. So luckily, when I left Dr. Chrono and I started my own company, I was really fortunate because usually in digital health, there's a weird, you end up begging the insurance companies for this information, right? If you want to help developers build applications to help doctors check eligibility, you're going to be begging the insurance companies to do it. But we did not have that problem, and I knew we wouldn't, because in 1996, this was introduced into the space. It's called Electronic Data Interchange. It's X12 EDI. So the protocols in 1996, these were mandated by the government. Every insurance company will give healthcare, real-time live queries in this data format. But obviously, this is not a data format that you want to parse or roll into your iPhone app, right? So that's where Eligible comes in. So actually, I just also want to talk a little bit about the protocols. I don't want to miss that. So the protocols also that they use for this are all 1996 protocols. So you have dial-up modems, you have SOAP APIs, you have X12 EDI interfaces, and you have fax machines. So just to really, hone in on the technical aspect, that's what we're dealing with. Now, because the insurance companies have spent so much money, because they've spent so much money implementing this, the government's not changing it anytime soon. They've spent millions of dollars, each individual insurance company, and there are over 1,000. So what we've decided to do is we meet all those protocols, we meet all that HIPAA compliance, and we build on top of it. So we take what they've done, and we've built simple REST API protocols on top of it. So we're genuinely just adding rocket fuel to a pretty massive market. To talk a little bit more about the tech and what we're enabling, the team implementation time that it would normally take to put eligibility queries into your iPhone application, you'd have a few engineers, take about 9 months of implementation. You'd be hooking up to individual over 1,000 health insurance companies. You'd have a HIPAA guy, you'd have a compliance guy. And now what we're enabling is developers to take about 3 hours, and it's an initial implementation. And for the most part, we're just rolling out the updates in the cloud. One of our biggest customers is Cario.com. They are a practice management system for over 15,000 doctors. And we got that sale in a hackathon. So I didn't go sell them. I didn't have to pitch them, right? They were able to implement us in 3 hours, and we beat out a bunch of old legacy providers because of that. So now those doctors get better eligibility information using us. Cool. So we connect over 700 health insurance companies. We're faster and cheaper than our competition. And if you're really interested, they say this is a $150 billion problem. Doctors are definitely willing to pay, and so are the pharmaceutical companies and the laboratories. So feel free to sign up on our website for a free API key, and we'll be giving out 600 of your first transactions for free. So if you have any questions, let me know. Thanks. Have a good day.
Afternoon, everyone. So, got it? No, I'm good. Thanks. Afternoon, everyone. So I work at Stripe, and we're making it easy to start accepting payments online. I want to just give a high-level run-through of everything that's available with our service, and then you can dig into it a bit more into the documentation on the website. So I think the first thing to dive into is how to do this with iOS. One of the most important ideas here is that you never want to touch your customer's credit card information on your servers because that puts you directly in the scope of PCI compliance. Anyone that's dealt with that, it's a nightmare, and you don't want to go down that road. So what we've been building are tools to enable you to collect this information and to make that really simple. In this instance, we recently released these Stripe iOS bindings, which are a simple way to send the data over to our servers. We'll store it on our end and then hand you back a token, which is a safe way to represent this payment information. Once you pass that over to your servers, we'll be able to turn it into actual charges. So you can see this is about as straightforward as it gets in an idiomatic way for Objective-C. So you pass in the card information, give us a success and error handlers, and then tie it all together with the create token with card call, and we'll be able to save that payment information for you. In the success handler, and hopefully everything worked out, you'll send the token over to your server, and that's the time when you actually use your secret API key to turn it into a real charge. And so I went with Ruby because I think most people can understand this. I don't know what the different languages are here. But basically, it's pretty simple. You just pass in the parameters to this create charge API call. You're passing in the token and the amount in cents. And then we'll turn that into an actual charge and pay you automatically. Now, there are a lot of ways to start collecting this payment information. I started with Stripe iOS because that's probably the most straightforward when you're going to be adding those credit card fields to your application. But you might also be working with websites. And so I also want to talk about Stripe.js. Stripe.js is just a little bit of JavaScript that you drop onto your website. It takes the information out of your payment forms, sends it over, and does the whole payment flow again with collecting the token and sending it to the server and so on. But recently, what we've realized is that creating payment forms is actually really difficult. And this is more the web end of it, and so I won't spend as much time on it. But it is pretty difficult whenever you're working with creating these payment forms because you want to get the input validation right, and you want to provide a nice flow for your users. And so what we recently released was something called Stripe Checkout. On the web end, what you see is this nice overlay that pops up, and it's this form to collect your customer's payment information. It replaces the whole Stripe.js flow that I just talked about, so you don't have to write a bunch of boilerplate JavaScript in order to collect this information, but instead, it'll take care of it for you, and we also build the form and everything else. Now, what really excites me about this, though, isn't so much the web thing, which is, it's kind of interesting, but it's the mobile part. At the same time, we built in mobile displays so that if your customers come in through an iOS or Android device, we'll display a native optimized form for this. And this is all to make it really easy for people to check out through your application or through your mobile website without you having to go through a bunch of work to format everything correctly. But I think better than all of that being taken care of is that we take care of it with just one HTML tag. You throw the script onto your page, and that'll take care of the whole flow of collecting your customer's payment information. Now, we're continuing to work with this part over time. We've been iterating on it over the past few months, and we've already increased app.net's conversion rate by 10%. And we're continuing to toy around with it and push updates live, so your form continues changing over time, making the payments aspect no longer something that you have to worry about, and instead giving you the time to focus on your application, and the checks just kind of come in at that point. Of course, you need to do error handling, and so I just want to touch on this briefly so you're somewhat familiar with it. On the server side, that's all taken care of through exceptions with most of our bindings. Each binding represents it in whatever way makes the most sense for the language, of course. But we throw out all this information, and we try, in general, to expose as much data as we can through our API, because we want to, in the end, give you the flexibility to display whatever you can to your customer. We don't want you constrained by something on our end. Now, with the token flow, one of the special parts of a token is that they're single use. Once you consume them, you can no longer consume them again, which seems fine, but then you run into this problem that you want to charge your customer a second time, and all of a sudden you have to ask their payment information again. So instead, we've created customer objects. You can consume the token to create a customer object. That'll save your payment information in the Stripe servers. And then you can reference this customer object whenever you're creating a charge. It will automatically pay for it. This leads to some nice properties, like subscriptions, which we build in for you. You're able to specify a plan, which is basically, you can think of it as a description of these recurring charges, to say that you want this general idea that someone's going to pay $50 a year to upgrade their Waffle subscription package, and this is just that general overall description, right? In the customer creation part, all you need to do is add one more parameter to that call, which is to specify the plan. We'll take care of charging your customer and then billing them every billing cycle thereafter. Our subscriptions, and this is another thing that we've tried to do generally with our API, we abstract away a lot of the parts that we don't think you should be dealing with, but we also want to give you the ability to dig in on the parts that you do want control over. So in particular with our subscriptions, you can specify monthly and yearly intervals, but you can also specify anything else in between by adding one more parameter to that create plan call. So you could say that you only want quarterly billing instead if you want to skip every 3 months. At the same time, you can specify trial periods, which I'm sure all of you know what those are, and coupons, which are flexible in themselves. As an example, you could specify a coupon that, with one API call, say that you want a coupon that gives 25% off for the first 3 months to the first 25 people that sign up, and it expires next Thursday. You could create that in one API call, specify it when you create the customer, and we'll handle all the logic for you. So you're not thinking about implementing these things over and over again. We also offer prorating, of course. So as your customers are switching plans, we're calculating the prices for you automatically. And with per seat pricing, it's just a multiple so that you can say that if you wanted to offer a $10 per month per person plan, you just need to override the quantity whenever you subscribe a customer. And it's another one of those ideas of we want to offer you the abstractions to where you can customize these without you having to think about all the edge case business logic that you'd usually have to go through. And finally, with subscriptions, we offer metered billing and manual control. And so that's where we really let you break out of the abstractions that we've come up with. The way we do that is through webhooks. So for those of you that aren't aware, webhooks are just a way for our servers to talk to your servers by sending an HTTP post. In this case, we'd send the invoice.created event, say that you're ready to be paid for that recurring cycle, and then you have the opportunity to add invoice items so you can adjust the bill however you want. This has some nice properties that you can say, if you put someone on a $0 per month plan and you want to only charge them based on usage, you wait until we reach out to you to say it's time to bill them, and then you tell us based on since their last bill how much they should be charged. And so that's a really simple thing that you can implement in about 5 lines. Of course, these webhooks extend throughout the rest of Stripe, and so we offer as much data as we can. These events are all the things that can happen in your Stripe account where we'll reach out and let you know. So you have the ability to act on them and update your accounting or do whatever else might have to happen on the back end. But again, without thinking of the flow of reaching out and finding the new information that's ready for you. I want to take a second and step away from the actual API part just to talk about the front end, because I think that's equally important when it comes to APIs. The first is, of course, that we offer a gorgeous interface through which you can check in on the health of your business through Stripe. But beyond that, I think one of the important things that's come about this dashboard is we started exposing everything that you can get through the API. In fact, this dashboard is built on top of our API, and everything that's available in the API is available in the dashboard, which means that anything that you can try from your command line, you can do through this interface. So it gives you a chance to try Stripe without having to write a single line of code. It also gives you a chance to step outside of your usual use cases and make exceptions, like giving a certain person a discount or giving other people on your team who aren't programmers access to have the same control that you do without you having to build a special interface for them like a dashboard. Of course, we support the team members for multiple user accounts. But I think more exciting than all of that, and the part that really gets me happy about this dashboard, is the log section. I used Stripe before we had this log section, and it was kind of hard to debug things because you all know the flow where you create an API call and something doesn't work in your program, and then you go into your program and you do an NS log to start dumping things out, or at least that's how I do it. And you start dumping all these things out, and it gets really obnoxious because you have to keep modifying your production code to figure out what might be going wrong. So instead, we expose all your API calls to this dashboard so you can see the requests and responses, and you can understand how you're interacting with our API and get some insight when things might be going wrong, or whenever you're developing and you want to understand how it's working. Now, that covers the whole API and everything that you can use to integrate Stripe on your own website. But we've recently been working on a different end of it, which is Stripe Connect. Stripe Connect is kind of like Facebook Connect in that it lets your users click a button, connect their account to your service, and get going from there. So in practice, what this might look like is, imagine you're creating a mobile photo marketplace. And so you want each of your customers to be able to upload their photos and start charging for them through your service. What this would look like is a button on your website or within your mobile app that sends them to the OAuth flow. Once they're there, they can connect their own Stripe account, or they can create a new one if they don't already have it. And this takes about 5 minutes if they don't have one. they press the submit button and they're redirected back to your website or back to your mobile app. What's so crucial there is in that redirection, we'll hand you their authentication keys. And so this is kind of invisible to the end user. If they're not technical at all, it's not a big deal. This is just kind of a usual thing that they're used to going through. But you get full access to their account. And so you can start making API calls on their behalf, making charges for people, or building analytics. So one of the neat use cases is Billy Coover made PayPad for iOS, which is the mobile dashboard for Stripe. And this uses Stripe Connect, where you can connect your account that way. And then finally, just looking at some of the business things, we of course shoulder the burden of the PCI compliance by going through the token flow that I described. So you're again not handling the credit card data yourself. We've extended the simplicity of our API to our pricing, which I think is equally important. You never want to interact with a great API only to be muddied later on trying to figure out how you're being billed. And so we only charge this one rate of 2.9% plus 30 cents per successful transaction. And it's instant activation. And beyond the instant activation, you can get started right away by just going to the Stripe website and copy and pasting any code sample. We don't require you to sign up to start working with API keys or anything. So you can toy around with it immediately. And all of our examples are built with that in mind. So you can just start copying and pasting from the documentation. That's everything that I had to cover. I'm unfortunately not going to be around to talk afterward, but I did want to extend an offer to everyone. If you want a free t-shirt, or if you want $1,000 of free processing through Stripe, just send me an email to michael@stripe.com, and I'll get in touch with you that way. Thank you, guys.
Hi, I'm Marcus Torres. I'm from Salesforce, and I'm the Director of Product Management over Force.com Mobile, which for those of you who don't know, Force.com is our platform as a service offering. So I'm here to talk about the APIs. If you've ever seen a Salesforce presentation, ever, you will know the next slide. So the next slide, if it goes through, no clicker, that's fine, is our safe harbor statement, which just basically everything I'm going to talk about today is our real APIs you can use today. In case I get a question about the roadmap or anything else, this is basically what our legal team tells me I have to put in here, which says if you're making any buying decision, do it based on what's currently available today and not what's going to happen in the future. All right, so instead of kind of going through each one of the APIs one at a time, I want to just talk about adoption for a second. So our platform has huge adoption in regards to APIs. We're already over 1 trillion records being processed by our API today. That it doubles year over year. So as you can see, kind of that's the top left graph. Maybe I won't get too close. The top left graph, do you see basically every year we're doubling. So by this time next year, we're going to be over 2.5 trillion records processed through our API. On the top right, you actually have our bulk API. And that bulk API essentially doubles every 3 to 4 months. And I'll go into what these are. But at the bottom is our streaming API. And again, this is already in the millions of records per hour that is being processed through our API. And so instead of going through the list, let's just talk about the scenarios. You guys want to build apps. Some of those may be enterprise focused. Some of those may even be consumer focused as far as the end user. So let's talk about how you would use our APIs to do that. So the first is probably the most relevant, this on-demand data integration. Essentially what you're doing is you're either going to pull data out of Salesforce or try to sync data from Salesforce. Am I the only person who's gotten this close? Or pull data from other on-premise systems, right? And you want to sync that up in your app. He's coming. Move it down, up. On my shirt. Technical difficulties. Good. Twist. Sweet. I have never, not once, done a speaking engagement where something with my audio hasn't happened. So I'm glad I'm consistent. So basically, this is where you're really kind of syncing your data, and you're saying, okay, what does my current data look like? What do my users look like? What do my accounts or my contacts look like? Or any custom object you'd create. And essentially, as people work within this app, you want to push those changes back into Salesforce. Maybe you want to push that to other enterprise systems, and you're really kind of maintaining those systems in sync, right? In regards to volume, we're talking millions of records here. We're not talking hundreds of millions, but this is usually the API people use for kind of several millions of records or even tens of millions. And this is where you don't have an opportunity to batch it, right? I know a lot of you are probably writing consumer apps, but let's talk about that for a second. The one thing we see changing across all of our customers is a huge ramp up in enterprises trying to build apps, whether those are departmental apps, what we call thematic, or single purpose apps, or just very general kind of mission critical cross-functional apps. And some of these applications, you don't have the ability to go ahead and batch a bunch of different operations and then process that later. And so when you do that, this is where our SOAP and REST APIs come into play. This is where it probably lands for most people in the room. Or standard REST API, of course, it's JSON, XML support, all the basic things you would expect, authentication via OAuth, and of course our SOAP API, right? Now our SOAP API we've had for quite a while, standard WSDL support, and again, this is in speeds of roughly 1 million records per hour. So as we kind of work through this, now let's think about loading massive data volumes. Now you're building an app in the enterprise. Maybe you're literally having to have an app used by thousands of partners, maybe they're distributors of yours. In this case, you have the ability to have asynchronous integration. Again, a very large amount of data, volume in the tens, hundreds of millions of records, speeds, the speed time. Now, for anyone who's ever done integrations before, you know that especially asynchronous integrations, when you're batching data together, records to data, updates together, speed is always the most critical thing. They always ask you, well, okay, fine, I batch everything every hour, every 30 minutes. Well, that might be 20 million records. How fast are you going to process that? What's the delta that I'm looking at? So if you look here at our bulk API, again, asynchronous service, it works with batches of 10,000 records. The default is 2,000 batches, so that's 20 million records by default. You could actually increase that to 20,000 batches, and then you have a much broader set of scale, right? So now you're loading hundreds of millions of records. This is our fastest API currently at Salesforce, and you're processing roughly 12 million records. I've seen as high as close to 20, but on average, 12 million records an hour. So one of our partners in Japan processed over 100 million records in a single day, and another large customer of ours has done over 1 billion transactions per month on average through this API. Now, the typical tools you would see, all the typical players you would have here that kind of work, if you had the question, well, all right, I understand this API, but who's used it, what tools are available, all the people you would expect, Informatica, IBM, Jitterbit. You could, of course, build your own custom solution, Java-based solution if you wanted to. But now let's talk about the third scenario. So custom calls in and out of Salesforce, right? We know that it's not always, what we provide are general purpose APIs. General purpose APIs to access any object as either standard or custom object that you'd create on our platform. And essentially these callouts, they're meant to support over 5 million users, over 100,000 customers on a multi-tenant platform. So because of that, they have to be general. But what about especially for mobile? One of the biggest challenges, one of the biggest siphons of or bottlenecks for mobile is clearly the bandwidth, the data bandwidth back and forth. So if you're constantly calling Salesforce or another system, you're going back and forth, you're creating latency in your application, right? So what we have here to combat this is what essentially custom APIs through Apex, SOAP, and REST. Now Apex is just kind of our native language. For anyone that knows Java, you could know Apex in about 5 minutes. But basically what it enables you to do is you can actually build out custom APIs, things that are not general purpose, right? And you can do a series of calls. From one single call that maybe happens in your app on the device, it could do 8 or 10 different calls on the server. Obviously there it's much faster processing. You have a much bigger bandwidth, and essentially return just that one result back to the client. And so you can do this via SOAP, you can do this via REST, but the whole point is it's now up to you, right? It's up to the developer to actually create any custom API that fits your needs. If you think about this from the context of mobile specifically, we've had a couple partners of ours, ISV partners, who created an app, and they were just having, they kept on complaining, oh, it just seems so slow, I'm making all these calls. Then what we looked into it, they were making, I think it was over a dozen calls just to render a single page, because they have multiple sources, multiple different APIs that they were calling for different objects. And then what we did is they wrote a single Apex REST API, kind of bundled everything together, returned just one payload to the device, and we saw dramatic performance. And so the last example or scenario I'd use is about real-time integration. And what I mean by real-time integration is the idea of changing states, right? Events that are happening, very much like notifications on real-time notifications that you would imagine within an application. And essentially, what you're doing is, what your requirement is the client, in this case the app, must receive immediate updates from Salesforce. How much data that actually happens in that event, it varies, right? There may be a large number of events, maybe it's a small number of events, but time is critical, right? And so for this, we have the real-time API. And so the real-time API, some examples of this are call center. Our own product uses this, Service Cloud, which is one of our core products at Salesforce. It uses this to manage essentially call center notifications and updates. We have integration with MuleSoft or Chatter. Chatter, of course, enables social in the enterprise. Again, all this streaming events, who's following you, who commented on you, who mentioned you. And of course, commerce. And so by using this API, the streaming API, you essentially remove polling, which is exactly what would happen with traditional APIs. With the streaming API, all you do is you set up basically a topic. And when you set up that topic, anyone that subscribes to that topic gets immediately notified anytime that event happens. It's all done server side as far as monitoring that topic, and then pushes that update out. And so so it's based on comment D, so WebSocket connections. Limits are not based on events, are based on events, not calls. So for example, if you ever deal with a service provider that has thresholds on how many requests you can make per second or per hour, in this case, it's really about events. And so you create an event, that event is now published, and whoever subscribes to that event gets published when it occurs or when it's fired. So standard tools here, MuleSoft, Comet D libraries, you can all the standard languages you would expect. And if there's one thing to take away, probably from everything here that I've said, it's probably this chart, which is very complicated. But this is the fact marketing didn't get to my slides before this. But the reality is we really have an API for any need. So whether that's mobile, maybe you're building an application, more of a backend application, maybe it's an integration, potentially it's just a feature or a service where you need scale and capability beyond what you have in your current application. We have the APIs to support you. So that is it for me. That was quicker than I thought, but I was told to be relatively quick. So there we go. I'll be here for questions afterwards. Thanks.
Hi. You guys hear me okay? Excellent. Wow, the advice that someone gives about imagining the audience naked is a terrible idea at a tech conference. No offense to most of you. My name is Marsh. I work at Apogee. Apogee exists to help machines talk to each other and to help people help the machines talk to each other. And before I get going here, so we can think about what's coming over the next 5 years, but before we do that, I want to talk about, just for a second, where we've been over the last 5 years. It's quite a distance. So 5 years ago is really when we began having computers in our pockets and computers that knew where they are, that are always connected, and understand their location. And that's a big deal. And the poster child, of course, this doesn't seem to be at full res. It seems really small. Oh well, it's big enough. Poster child, of course, in the iPhone, that's when things tipped. Where instead of having a mouse or a stylus, you used your finger. It was much more personal, it was much more intuitive, and computing became fun in a way that it hadn't before. And then over those same 5 years, we've seen almost as much innovation happening on the server side as we have on the client side. So at the bottom, starting from the bottom, working our way up, infrastructure as a service. Quick. There we go. Companies like Amazon, obviously, being a great example of that. Platform as a service. Heroku and Marcus, who's part of the Salesforce family. And then software as a service. Google Apps being a great example of that. And so all of these great things have been happening on the cloud side. And all of those clients, with the proliferation of clients that we've had, they're all talking to these services using APIs. And then we're even seeing some specialization in those layers. So Backend as a service has come up a lot in the last year. Companies like StackMob and Parse and UserGrid, which if you don't know it, it's Apache licensed, and Apogee offers it as a hosted service. These things all exist because time and again, we've seen the same patterns. Users, lots of apps have them. Those users have relationships with objects and things. And all of that, those patterns over time became obvious, and the backend as a service category emerged. So that's a lot in 5 years. It's, it's hard to even think back that far and try to imagine yourself then seeing all those things happen over 5 years. But what's happening over the next 5? And so let's think, because there's one thing we know that's coming in the next 5 years. 2018, something was predicted. Here's a hint. Involves machines talking to each other. Skynet. Yes, Skynet. Because Skynet is coming, and Skynet is powered by APIs. And so you can't expect a Schwarzenegger type to come back and save you from not using APIs the right way. Now is the time to get ahead of it. So in the spirit of that, I have 4 quick tips that will help you survive. So actually, I wanted this slide to be a picture of my father-in-law's foot. But I didn't do that for 2 reasons. One, I wasn't sure how to ask him without explaining why I wanted to use it. And 2, his foot is pretty gross, and I didn't want to sick you all out by putting it up on here. But so let me tell you about it and why I think it's important. The foot, it turns out, the health of the foot is a good indicator of the general health of the person. It's not a perfect indicator, but you can learn a lot from looking at someone's foot, particularly with the elderly. So as you get older and you get less flexible and you lose your sense of balance, it gets harder to take care of your feet. And then your feet begin to hurt. You don't move around as much. Your mobility decreases. It changes your natural level of activity. And all of that adds up. And so patients, doctors, geriatrics, often will look at their patient's feet to get a general sense of the health of the patient. So I have some rules of thumb or rules of foot that will help you look at APIs and make those kinds of assessments. Again, remember, these are general cases because actually my father-in-law is in amazing health. The fact that his feet look terrible hasn't had an impact yet. Maybe it will, but no. So these are just general rules of thumb or foot. So let's see. First, you always need to stop and think about the business model of the service you're looking to use. How is it that they make money? This isn't that dissimilar from the question of free versus paid apps and whether or not you are the product of a free app. That's germane to this. But if you can't understand how they make money, you should stop and think. One example I'll give you here is Simple Geo. Does anyone remember Simple Geo? They were actually just up the street. They had some really cool technology. They were doing some really neat things, but they hadn't really found what their business model would be. At least it wasn't obvious to me. Maybe their business model was an exit because they were bought by Urban Airship. And I don't know if that was for technology. I don't know if that was a talent acquisition. But what I do know is that they shut down the Simple Geo endpoints at some point. And all the apps that had depended on it until then didn't work anymore. So understanding whether a service has good general health based on whether their business model makes sense to you is something you should think about. Second, where are they in their own life cycle? So 5 years ago, I have to do the math, but mobile was not an important piece of Twitter's strategy at that time. And lots of the innovation around the Twitter API happened with mobile clients. And then at some point, that changed. And Twitter began to consider that mobile was core of the Twitter experience. And they said, look, we're going to invest in this. They actually, I think some people criticize them for it, but I think they did a pretty good job of trying to declare their intent in a way that was good for the community. They said, look, this is important. We're going to be investing in it. You should think twice before you do that yourselves. Something to think about. If you are working in the mobile space and you can anticipate that service is going to move into that space, you might want to consider whether you should be building what's directly in their path. Some forecasting, but it's definitely stop and think about it. 3, terms of service. They're boring, but don't ignore them. In the same way that you wouldn't use code that you hadn't written in the app you were working on without understanding the license that it came with, you should make sure you understand the terms of service of a provider, right? One of my favorite examples is Aviary. I don't know if you're familiar with them or not, but not only are their legal terms reasonably easy to digest, they went the extra mile and they have these call-outs on the side that in plain English tell you what they're trying to say. If they spent that much time thinking about their developers, their users, and the kinds of information, the ways they can make it easier for them, if they're doing that level of hygiene, that's a great indication. If you read boilerplate terms of service, it doesn't mean that the service is unhealthy, but it's an opportunity for a service to say, look, we're really thinking carefully about this, and we care about you. Survival tip number 4, don't forget that you're a sharecropper. So it's kind of amazing that all of these services exist. It used to be you'd have to build all of those things yourself. And today, you can draft off of the fact that these services exist to build things you couldn't do before, and to build things that you don't have to maintain yourself in the same way. And that's really great. It means you can move faster. It means you can focus on the thing that makes your app different and better. But it also means that there are things that are beyond your control, and that literally, like a sharecropper, the ground that you're working doesn't belong to you. That's not a bad thing. I mean, there's this connotation with sharecropping that it's exploitative, but it's actually a pattern that's persisted through history, and oftentimes it is there are lots of good reasons for it being, and it's not all that dissimilar. So how many people here live in San Francisco? I do, I don't know. And keep your hands up. How many of you rent in San Francisco? Yeah, good, that's kind of what I figured. Me too. I've chosen to build, my family has chosen to build its home in a house that we don't own. It's not all that dissimilar from sharecropping in that ground does not belong to us. So things that are out of your control are always scary. And living in the Bay Area, surrounded by all these fault lines, we, if anyone, should have a sense of what it means to build when you don't expect the ground underneath to move. There are ways you can deal with this in how you build and approach your apps and how they work with APIs. And I'm going to talk about that in a little bit. But before I do, just up the street at AT&T Park, home of the Giants, if you haven't taken a tour of the stadium, I recommend it. It's one of the coolest bits is that the stadium is actually built in sections so that during an earthquake they can move independently. And if you can see where the arrows are pointing, probably shouldn't use orange, but if you can see where the arrows are pointing, those are sections of rubber that they put in place so that when the sections of the stadium move independently, they don't rupture the pipes. Thinking about how to be flexible when the ground shifts is important to making great apps. So just a quick recap, those 4 sort of general hygiene and survival tips. Make sure you understand the business model. Consider the services lifecycle and where they are in it. Don't ignore the terms of service. Read them, one, because it's the right thing for you to do, for your users, for your service. And then don't forget your sharecropping. That being said, there are going to be lots of other issues. Authentication services tend to be different, all of them. It would be nice if OAuth 2 became more entrenched and adopted, but the Flickrs of the world, the Twitters of the world, the LinkedIns of the world are still on OAuth 1.0a. There are going to be APIs that aren't under your control. You'll face things like cross-origin resource sharing issues. There'll be logic bloat in your presentation tier. And so this brings me to something that, a pattern that we've seen as we work with API providers, as we work with app developers at Apogee. Something that we recently did a webinar we call the new 3-tier architecture. So let's rewind a tiny bit first and talk about how things used to be. So in the web, you had the holy trinity, HTML, CSS, JavaScript, and that would all be rendered in the browser. That was the presentation layer. There's back-end logic that happened, things like Rails, PHP. And those servers were connected to databases. And if you put that all together, we have the presentation layer, and we have the logic layer, and at the bottom we have the data layer. And that's what powered a lot of the web and the mobile web. But then when we look at app development, we see this new 3-tier architecture. So now you've still got this presentation layer, and whether you're using HTML, CSS, JavaScript, or whatever you like natively, they're still depending on APIs at the bottom. Whether that's APIs for a backend as a service, whether that's your own servers that you've written yourself, that your app's talking to with APIs. We see this proxy pattern emerging where you can put a lot of your tech logic. So by tech logic, I mean perhaps using an API that only returns JSON and you'd rather have it as XML or vice versa. You can do that in a proxy layer. It gives you that flexibility too, so that when things change. So a good example of this, I'm going to guess a lot of people are pretty familiar with the Twitter API. 43 days from now, version 1 will be laid to rest. It will be deprecated. And 2 major things, in my mind, are happening then. One, so they will no longer have unauthenticated calls. All calls must use OAuth. Actually, I can add a third one now. Their API patterns, the resources are literally going to be deprecated and die. So if you don't update the version information in your resources, they just stop working. And then 3, they're end-of-lifing XML because they can. No one likes XML anymore. It's not cool. But there are apps out there that are still using it, and they stop working in 43 days. you can fix that kind of a problem on an API that you don't control if you choose to control it in the proxy layer. And what that enables you to do is make changes to your apps without having to push a new version to the App Store. Will it go through in time? I don't. Anyway, those are the kinds of things you can do with this new 3-tier architecture. Here's some of the ways you can begin. So you start with the presentation tier. Look for APIs that'll meet your app requirements. Remember, you will run into issues and blockers along the way. Some of those you'll be able to work around in the API layer. Keep watch for bloat in your presentation tier and move that technical bloat into the cloud. At the same time, watch for bloat that's happening in the proxy and make sure that you move business logic behind an API. The non-functional requirements, like the transformations, JSON, XML, that kind of thing, those non-functional requirements, you can move from individual APIs to the proxy level and live in happy rainbow land. This is the kind of thing we blog about, write about, do webcasts on all the time. We try to collect them all up and give them to the world. You can find them at that URL or just search for our best practices, including a much longer version of the 3-tier architecture if you're interested in diving into that further. And thank you.
Well, thank you, Michael, Marcus, Marsh, and Caitlin. So we're going to do a shared Q&A now. We have some questions queued up on Twitter here. We're going to pass the spare lav mic around, I think, as a time saver. And you still have one? You're off? Okay. So keep yours on. Okay. So a few questions came through for Michael of Stripe, first of all. Some of these are easy. Does Stripe plan to implement payments for European companies anytime soon?
Yeah, you bet. We've been on this since day one, and just as a bit of background, some of the holdup is that we want to get the integration right. We're not comfortable shipping anything international if it's not a first-class citizen, and so we've been working to make those integrations the right integrations. But it's coming, and we will have it when it's ready, which should be soon.
ETA?
No ETAs yet.
Of course not.
Yeah.
Does Stripe have analytics for LTV, ARPU, etc.?
So we expose all the data that you need to get those analytics, but we don't currently offer them. I've had an interest in adding more reporting to our dashboard, and so, I mean, if there's specific needs that someone has, please email me, michael@stripe.com. I'd love to chat more about it, but we just haven't added them right now.
Makes sense. And then given Apple's, obviously, rules about in-app purchases, what are people doing with iOS on Stripe specifically?
Yeah, so the in-app purchase thing is pretty interesting. And I don't know all the guidelines, and so forgive me on that. But if you actually look at it, you can make purchases that are outside of the in-app flow. So if you look at services like Exec that do this. And I think it has to do with the type of content that you're buying, whether it's purely digital and something that is in-app versus a real-world service. And so that's a pretty big distinction and somewhere where you get more leeway.
Okay. Stripe's API has languages bindings for Java, Ruby, PHP, Python, anything for iOS?
So on the iOS end, we offer the Stripe iOS bindings, and that gets you everything you need to collect your customers' payment information. On the server end, the part that you would do server side, which is the actual charging, we don't natively support that. Presumably, if you're building an iOS app, you could interact with our API directly, but we don't offer binding support because it doesn't make sense in the majority of cases. In the majority of cases, you're offering this app to your users, and they're entering their payment information there. So you wouldn't want them to have access to your secret keys because that would be not good.
Makes sense. Yeah. Question for Marcus. So someone says there is an Objective-C SDK for Salesforce. Why haven't you talked about it? Would you like to talk about it now?
Sure. So we do have a mobile SDK for both iOS and Android. They're both open source. The only reason why I didn't talk about it is because I really wanted to focus on the APIs. If you look at who's seen a Salesforce screen ever? Anyone? Who thinks that it looks nice? Even me. The fact is I wanted to focus on the APIs because what we've seen across Salesforce at our customers, our ISV partners, is that people are taking our APIs because we give access to all of our features, not all of them, but most of them. And they're really being able to innovate and bring a whole new experience and a whole new level of satisfaction across our customers. And we have thousands of people have used our mobile SDK to really create awesome apps based on our platform. So I didn't talk about that specifically because I was just focusing on the APIs. But if you have any questions about that, you can either tweet them or ask them now, and I can go into more detail if you like.
General question for you guys as API vendors. You can both answer this. What do you say to developers who say, look, we've been burned on these things before. We're not sure if we can build a business on your land. Why should we sort of trust you, choose you? What can you say to us to make us feel better about that?
Well, this is an easy one for me because if Salesforce, our number one value at Salesforce is trust. If you've ever seen any Dreamforce or Cloudforce, our actual values as how we roll out products, how we deliver releases is all based on trust.
What's number 2 value?
There's 3 values, the 1%. So we always give 1% of our product, 1% of our profits, and 1% of our time to charity. And what's our third one?
I just want to see if there are more than one.
But when it comes to trust, we really care about people's access to APIs, access to your data, and if there's one thing, we actually, depending on who you believe, we actually kind of coined the term platform as a service. Force.com has been around for many, many years, and if there's one thing that's not going away, it's our APIs. We have full versioning, so APIs that were written 5 years ago are still available and in use today. And so from that perspective, I think we're a great use case for those APIs. So you don't have to deal with some of the challenges. Even, for example, with Twitter, I built an app for Dreamforce and some of our events, and I have to go and change it based on some of the changes that they're making. So there you go. And then 5 more days in the Apple Store. That's awesome.
Yeah, on our end, it's, we're doing this because we're also entrepreneurs, and so this leads all the way back to the founders, Patrick and John, who had been building their own companies and realized that it was just really frustrating to accept payments online. And so, this is something that we care very deeply about because it's impacted us before and stopped us from doing things. I guess the other thing that I'd mention is that we just care a lot. I mean, I genuinely, when I'm in the chat with our users, I feel like I'm talking to my best friends. It's a live chat. I've got some really great hackers in there working on awesome projects, and we get to sit there and help out and be part of that. And so it's something that we care a lot about. And I guess I'll share the one story that I really like, which was when I was founding my company, I just launched it. It was, we were doing the whole press launch and everything, and I was stupid and didn't sleep the night before because I thought, I'll fix all the bugs the night before the launch and there won't be any problems, and this will go, right? That's how that works out. So during the launch, I realized that, no, I can't fix every bug, and this was fine. I was fixing them as I found things. But one of my larger customers came in and sent me an email and said, hey, so I typed in my credit card number and I hit the order button and it didn't do anything. And as you're reading this in this tired state, you just get the feeling of dread because your customer is basically handing his credit card number to you and you can't accept it. There's some barrier there. So I emailed Stripe support, said, hey, no, it's not your bad, but do you guys have any insight here? Because I'm at a bit of a loss, and this is before we had logs in the dashboard. Greg got back to me in 30 minutes and told me, hey, here's the logs that we see in our servers for that IP address. So it looks like he is hitting the token endpoint. But I was looking at your JavaScript and I saw some errors on this line, and maybe that's causing an issue for this guy because it looks like it would run into that. And it was this feeling of just extreme, I don't know how to phrase it almost, because I went from this 2-person startup to a team of 15 standing behind me, and someone that's going to be there to help. And so while I'm working on support at Stripe and working on those things, we just carry that forward, and we're always going to do things to support our users.
Go on.
So in some ways, a different answer, but it's also to some degree easy to answer. It's a great question, by the way, Evan. With UserGrid, for instance, that is a service that we offer, but it's also an open source project. So at any point in time, you could take your toys and go play elsewhere, right? So it is in our best interest to keep our service reliable. We have a fabulous ops team that does that kind of thing. But there's always an escape clause, and we think that's important for backend as a service.
Okay. Actually, here's a question that's been retweeted a couple times. It's probably a good one for you to start with, Marsh. Is there an opportunity to apply what Privacy Choices did for the privacy policy, but for terms of service instead?
Could you repeat it?
Oh, yeah. So is there an opportunity to do something similar to Privacy Choices, but for terms of service rather than for privacy policy?
Sure. No, I think that's absolutely. And so I didn't mean that terms of service and looking at to see how well they'd been crafted and whether they were thinking about the people reading them. That's just an indicator. It has the ability to suggest that they'll go the extra mile, but it's not a hard and fast rule, right? It's just heuristic. So if they did that, privacy policies are arguably just as important as terms of service, and so they shouldn't be ignored either.
Is Caitlin still here? No, I had a question for Caitlin. Anything else you want to talk about? I mean, actually, one thing I'm always kind of curious about in this sort of thing is how do you think about designing APIs for developers? I mean, I guess, Michael, you probably have some thoughts on this, but what do you think about when you build an API that a bunch of people you don't know are going to have to use?
Yeah, so we think about discoverability a lot, and how can you take a look at this API and just from the start, you're completely fresh to it and do something. Because the biggest thing that most hackers want is the ability to do something and then make little tweaks and see what happens when you make the tweak, because that's how you understand what the different inputs do. And so from the API design perspective itself, it originally started out as a single endpoint where you just posted everything to one endpoint, and it was kind of a mess. And so we reorganized it around this RESTful design and made it to where everything's very intuitive. If you say that there's list all the transfers in your account, which isn't documented yet, I know how to do that, and just because I know how to list anything else in my Stripe account. Similarly, on the documentation, and I think that's extremely important. One thing that we found helpful is we populate the documentation with your API keys and with actual objects from your account if you're logged in. And if you're not logged in, we still give you data that works, and so you can get started with it right away. And you can copy and paste anything from our documentation into a terminal, and you will get an output from the API. And so this just means that you don't ever have to sign up. You don't have to go through any hurdles. You can see what you're getting right out of the box.
Any thoughts on the evolution of Salesforce API? Like historically, or
well, historically, it's been more complicated than less complicated. To be honest, when you look at kind of who our primary audience was, it was the enterprise. We typically worked with, a lot of SI. So kind of traditionally, we've been more complicated. We've had APIs and a platform as a service probably longer than most, if not all, companies, right? So one of the big things that we're trying to, tackle ourselves is the simplicity that you see in certain platforms today, whether that's Parse or Stripe. It's really providing that ease in an API so that it is very simple to
over
get
time, it's
features.
actually gotten simpler.
So over time, it has gotten simpler and is getting simpler as a way just to enable the ecosystem of developers that are building mobile applications and applications in general.
It's probably a fairly big API as APIs go, right?
It's huge, yeah. And one of the things that we do have now, which as a company, is every new feature on our platform is API first. So we actually build API first and then follow it with all the UI or other treatment that's around that feature.
Is there anything not covered by API that you kind of like to?
No, not really.
So
yeah, I'm sure we still have I know we still have a few gaps in regards to kind of legacy things that we
it's near perfect.
No, I think perfect is not attainable per se. It's always a work in progress, but I think we're moving in the right direction.
All right, Marsh, any thoughts on what you like to see in a good API?
Yes, and this could probably fill an entire session that we could all do next year. But if there were one principle that I would call out, it would be obviousness. Great design has this quality of obviousness that you can look at it and know what it is. And I think that that's most manifest in API design when looking at resources and thoughtful naming. I think it was Alan Kay who said that the two hardest problems in computer science are cache invalidation and naming, right? And I think that goes down to thinking about what you call things. And we saw this pattern on the web as URLs became more people-friendly. They stopped being these strings of numbers and digits and started being meaningful. That was good for the search engines, the Googles of the world, but it was also good for people who could then hack the URL and get where they wanted faster. It's more important with APIs to have that quality of obviousness. So that's one. The other thing, I like what Marcus, you were saying, that everything's API first. I think if you are building an API and if your developers and your engineers are using that API themselves, just that's the easiest feedback loop you can have. That kind of a feedback loop to be able to use it and understand what it gets right and what it gets wrong is one of the best ways to discover it before it gets outside your walls.
I mean, on that sort of obviousness and readability point, do you think it was a net loss when we all kind of ditched XML and started using JSON? I mean, I'd rather use JSON as a programmer, but then remember the wars over this.
I do, yeah. And there have been many casualties around this battle.
Back to the Terminators.
Yeah, exactly. I wonder if Skynet will use XML or JSON.
That's been retweeted about 400 times, by the way, the line about APIs and Skynet.
Good, excellent, good.
I mean, I think you just won Renaissance so far.
Yes. So, yeah, personally, XML, it's going to come down to personal preference. I find JSON readable, just as readable as XML myself. When it's minified, obviously it's harder, but as soon as you put it through some pretty printing, it's easy to read again. I think it's easier to write in some ways too, but that's just me. What I really like about it is that I like prototyping things in JavaScript, and so having native, JavaScript object notation just works. So if there's no parsing, I feel better.
So no loss.
Yeah.
I guess a couple last questions. So where are you guys going from here in your APIs and products? I mean, obviously you can't say things that are in development, but broadly speaking, what's the vision?
Sorry,
go first if you want.
No, it's fine. So, I guess for us, it really. So besides being API first for new features, we need to kind of round the corners and kind of get complete kind of wholeness around some of our other functionality that's been developed in the past. I can't talk to specific products or APIs, but one of the things that you've seen at least in my graph and kind of from the pure numbers that our platform delivers in regards to API scale, we're delivering literally over 1 trillion, we're processing over trillions of records now per year. We're doing hundreds of millions of records of transactions, API calls, every month. Over 1 billion even in some months, or by customer. And I'm just talking by customer, not across the entire customer landscape. So, and you know what we get constantly queried about? When is it going to be faster? I need 50 million. I need 50 million per hour. Really? Do you really? Sometimes it's really, and it's an implementation. Sometimes we start to talk to them and we find out, wow, you really could be doing this another way and take it down by tenfold. But when you look across our customers and some of our largest customers, that's where we're spending a lot of our time, is really on the scale to get to the 50, 80, 100 million per hour.
Well, actually, do you have small customers? I mean, are there indie developers
absolutely.
in Salesforce too?
Yeah, no, absolutely. So the biggest section of our customers are SMBs, like kind of small, medium business. I forget what the actual count is, but I'm going to say somewhere up to 200, 250 seats or users within that customer. But our largest customers clearly are the big guys that have 10, 20, 150,000 actual licenses with us in a single instance of Salesforce. So.
Okay. Yeah. What's ahead for Stripe?
So I guess the obvious thing is going to more countries. We're working on that. Beyond that, it's simplifying our API and continuing to maintain the simplicity and round off any rough edges. So as an example, we've always maintained backwards compatibility in our API. We've quietly done this for people because we never want to break someone. And so recently what we rolled out is a dynamically generated changelog that you can upgrade yourself and that you can specify in your own bindings. And so any kind of application you're creating, you can control the upgrade flow and pick the version of the API that works best for you. And you're guaranteed that this will always work for anyone that uses your program, which we think is just hugely important. Beyond that, it's working with things like Stripe Connect to make it easier for people to start accepting payments online in any kind of scenario. One of the things that I'm hoping someone will build is an accounting system with Stripe Connect, which is you can imagine this world in which we're using webhooks to send data to an external service, and it would automatically tally up your books, and you never have to do accounting again. It would be this wonderful, wonderful world, and hopefully we can get there. I think this is actually an attainable dream at this point, and we're just going to continue building out other features that make it easy to accept payments in any of these scenarios.
Okay. One last question. Marsh, you get the blue sky question. Where are APIs going from here?
Can I say Skynet again?
Yeah.
I mean,
yeah, keep using that one, but also...
where are APIs going from here?
Are there trends in APIs? How about
Sure, more and more, right? And the Internet of Things obviously is going to be another big thing. APIs are again, just to reuse the line, they're how the machines talk to each other, and we're only going to see more and more of that happening over the next few years. I think.
So do you think APIs will be more made for machines to generate and less made for humans to?
Ooh, that's a good question. Wow. You should ask a machine. But I want to go back to your original question for a second and say that one aspect of the three-tier architecture I was talking about is that in some ways you can think about how the client application is moving off of the device and the front edge of it is now in the cloud. And you see some of that with Apex and the ability to combine calls and have these virtual APIs. I think it's going to be a big story of the next few years.
Okay. I think we're about done the session. Thank you, Michael, Marcus, Marsh, and Caitlin. And thank you.
Yes, thanks, Evan, too. That was great. Very well done.